Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mazzoro, and today I want to go over our very last region that we're going to talk about in the benthic chapter, ice. The poles, the Arctic and Antarctic, the North Pole and the South Pole. Again, these aren't true formal benthic regions like the other five were. We're going to talk about the benthic region of ice, but we're also going to talk about the pelagic animals that live in ice, and we'll talk about the animals that live on ice surface. For no other reason than this is the best place to put it, and it's the best place where the only place where we're going to be able to talk about those animals. So we'll start talking about the two polar regions of Earth, and then we'll talk about how organisms need to be adapted to live in those polar regions. And last, we'll finish up with what they're eating and how they stop themselves from freezing in those polar regions. So the two polar regions on Earth are the North Pole and the South Pole. The North Pole is called the Arctic, and that's where polar bears live. There are no polar bears in the South Pole. The South Pole is called the Antarctic, and it's where emperor penguins live. There are no emperor penguins in the North Pole. The Antarctic is a continent, whereas the Arctic is just an ice shelf. It's parts of Greenland and Russia and Alaska and then a lot of glacier. Arctic's the north, Antarctic is the south. Santa Claus lives in the Arctic. No one except emperor penguins lives in the Antarctic. In order to live in the Arctic or the Antarctic, organisms need to be adapted to survive two really tough conditions. One, it's really, really, really cold in the Arctic. As a result, organisms need to be adapted to stop themselves from freezing. Also, there's very little food and very little primary production in the Arctic and Antarctic, so organisms need to be able to find food and be able to eat in order to supply their bodies with food. Let's first talk about how organisms find food in the Arctic. So, here we go. Primary production really is few and far between. There aren't really any plants up there to speak of, and there is some kelp, but not much. The main source of primary production actually comes from these organisms, what are known as sympagic organisms. Sympagic organisms are tiny little microscopic organisms, plankton, that live inside brine channels in the ice. When salt water freezes, the fresh water freezes, and it often freezes around super briny water, channels of super briny water. And on a microscopic level, these solid ice actually resemble Swiss cheese. There's actually forms of phytoplankton and zooplankton that live inside the holes of this Swiss cheese ice. And as light shines through the ice, these phytoplankton can photosynthesize and feed the zooplankton and any organism that lives inside the ice. And all of these organisms together are known as sympagic organisms. When the ice begins to melt, these sympagic organisms get released into the water, and that causes a bloom after the light-limited winter of the ocean, like we learned about in ecology. Light-limited winter of the Arctic. So we have seaweeds, no plants, and then sympagic organisms that are going to be our main primary producers. In terms of pelagic organisms, fish, you're going to have organisms that eat those sympagic organisms, like phytoplankton and zooplankton when the ice melts after the light-limited winter. You'll also have some predatory fish. However, there are very, very few top-level predators, a lot more filter-feeding and suspension-feeding organisms. And the reason is there's not a lot of organisms to eat in the Arctic. So there's not going to be a lot of predators that depend only on finding organisms to eat in the Arctic. In terms of the benthic organisms that live in the Arctic, you're not going to have any sediment. And the reason you don't have any sediment on the ground in the Arctic Ocean is not because there's a lot of wave energy. It's instead because of glaciers. As glaciers kind of scrape along the bottom of the ocean, they're going to crush and grind any organisms that are on the bottom of the ocean. And for that matter, they're also going to scrape off all the little bits and traces of sediment that are on the bottom of the ocean. No sediment means no deposit feeders, only suspension feeders. And your main suspension feeders in polar regions are going to be what are known as glass sponges. And these are them, clear glass sponges, literally sponges made out of silica glass. These glass sponges, like coral, have a mutualistic relationship with algae that allows them to photosynthesize in what is relatively a nutrient-poor environment as light shines through the ice. Other organisms are going to be scavengers, or they're actually going to eat the dead the sponges on the bottom of the Arctic benthic regions. So let's transition now from what organisms are eating to how organisms are stopping themselves from freezing. And before we start talking about freezing, let's talk about why that's a bad thing. First of all, being cold isn't a bad thing. Your body temperature can be reduced to 50 degrees Fahrenheit for a prolonged period of time and do relatively little damage to yourself. It's called protective hypothermia. In fact, some people that are recovering from like really, really bad surgery, or some people that are dying very, very quickly and doctors want to prolong their life, they'll actually artificially lower their body temperature to those temperatures to prolong their life. So getting cold isn't a bad thing. What is a bad thing is freezing. And freezing is a bad thing for two reasons. One, when water freezes inside cell membranes, it expands, and that could pop the cell membranes or burst them. And as a result, when thawing takes place, basically all those cells deflate. And that's what happens. Here's a tomato before it was frozen, the same tomato after it was frozen. All those cells burst inside that tomato, and it was basically turned into mush. The second problem is that when water thaws, it often forms microscopic razor-sharp edges like this. And these tiny little microscopic razor-sharp ice crystal edges can slice and eviscerate cell membranes and organelles inside cells and really do damage to the insides of cells. Both of these together means that it's not being cold that's bad for you. It's freezing that's bad for you. So organisms in the Arctic don't stop themselves from being cold. They're going to be cold. They're in some cases, negative 60 degrees Fahrenheit with negative 100 degrees Fahrenheit wind chills. But how do they stop themselves from freezing? Well, there's three ways. The first is antifreeze proteins. Literally proteins inside certain fish that stop their bodies from freezing, just like antifreeze stops the water from freezing inside your radiator of your car. The second is a sausage body shape. Many marine mammals, and organisms for that matter, have an elongated body shape with their organs in the very, very center. Anyone that's cooked sausage can tell you that the last part of sausage to cook is going to be the center. And as a result, the last part of sausage to cool is going to be the center. So if you pack all of your vital organs toward the very, very center of this sausage body shape, what you stop is as the outside freezes, you stop the internal organs from freezing and therefore potentially save your life. Last, many marine mammals have blubber, which is more than just an insulative layer of fat. It's actually a non-vascular layer of fat. And the lack of vascularization, the lack of blood surging through that layer, stops your blood from cooling artificially on the outside and keeps your blood nice and warm and towards the center of your body. So let's talk about each one of those adaptations individually. First with antifreeze proteins. Antifreeze proteins are super, super cool, partially because modern scientists has no idea how they work. We know that fish have them, but crazy as it seems, antifreeze proteins are what's called non-colligative. That means they're not concentration dependent. If you think of the antifreeze inside your radiator, you need to add a 50-50 water to antifreeze mixture to your radiator to keep that water from freezing even at negative 20. Fish regularly swim in waters that are colder than that, and yet they don't freeze. And they don't freeze because they have much less of this antifreeze protein inside their bodies. So how? They have very, very little of this protein. How does it stop their entire bodies from freezing? Well, we don't know. The main thought is mainly that it probably forms on the surface of these tiny ice crystals and just stops them from being able to form in the first place. So you only need a very small amount forming on the very, very starts or beginnings of these ice crystals in order to stop the ice crystals dead in its tracks from forming. Antifreeze proteins is how fish can swim around in sub-freezing water and still live. If we took you and dumped you into that freezing water, you would turn into a little ice cube. That water is actually below freezing because, keep in mind, it's salt water. But fish don't freeze because of their antifreeze proteins. The second is a sausage body shape. If you notice a pattern with all of these organisms, they all have an elongated body shape, and in all of them, their internal organs are focused in the very, very center. This guarantees that any freezing damage that may happen on the outside of these organisms isn't actually harming their internal organs, their hearts, their liver, their kidneys, the important stuff that they need to live. As a result, sausage body shape actually allows these organisms to resist damage from freezing cold temperatures. Last but not least, we have blubber and fur. Marine mammals have blubber and fur. Again, blubber is more than just a layer of fat. People are fat and they get cold still. People are fat and they can die of frostbite. What blubber is a non-vascular layer of fat. You can see as these Eskimos cut away this layer of blubber, there's very, very, very little blood on the bottom. It's that non-vascularization that allows this to be an insulative layer while not letting the blood that would otherwise surge through it cool your body overall. And then there's fur. Fur traps warm air against your body and basically helps insulate organisms just like a blanket or layers of clothing help insulate you. So that's it. We talked going all the way back. We talked about the two polar regions, the Arctic and the Antarctic, how there's polar bears in the Arctic and emperor penguins in the Antarctic. We talked about how all organisms, polar bears, penguins, and alike, need to be adapted to live in low nutrient conditions, as well as adapted to live in very, very cold conditions and stop themselves from freezing. In terms of what they eat, we talked about sympagic organisms in the ice, providing most of the primary production, along with some polar kelp. We talked about pelagic organisms, mostly suspension feeding on those sympagic organisms when the ice melts during the summer, as well as some predatory fish, but not very many. And then we talked about benthic organisms, mostly sponges. There's no deposit feeding because there's no sediment, and you're going to have sponges with mutualistic relationships to algae, as well as scavengers or organisms that eat the sponges themselves in the benthic environment. And last, we talked about why freezing is a bad thing and how organisms stop themselves from freezing. If you're a fish, antifreeze protein. If you're a general marine mammal or other organisms in the Arctic, you're probably going to have a sausage body shape, elongated body shape with shorter limbs. And if you're a marine mammal, you might even have layers of blubber or fur. All of these are ways that organisms are adapted to survive from the cold of freezing. So that's it. That's the last for benthic organisms. Our next unit is on pelagic organisms, fish and sharks and skates and rays and all of that fun stuff that swims through the ocean. So stay tuned and I hope you enjoy it.